I still remember the exact moment the young man laughed and said the carousel on the Santa Cruz beach boardwalk was just a sweet old relic nobody really rides anymore, and the strange hollow feeling that spread through my chest as if someone had quietly opened a window inside me and let the ocean wind blow straight through. It was the spring of 2002, and the meeting had been called in a low wooden hall a few streets back from the boardwalk. The kind of building that always smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, where folding chairs scraped softly against the floor and the fluorescent lights hummed above like tired insects. Outside, the Pacific breeze carried the familiar scent of saltwater and caramel popcorn, drifting inland from the boardwalk just the way it had every summer evening for as long as I could remember. I had chosen a seat near the back. Not because anyone had told me to sit there, and not because I was shy exactly. When you get to my age, you learn something simple about rooms full of younger people making plans. The back row is where time quietly gathers to listen. There were maybe 20 people in the room. Investors. City representatives. A couple of event planners with sleek laptops open in front of them. One man wearing a bright blue blazer spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the world would make room for his ideas. On the wall behind him hung a poster board showing a digital rendering of what they were proposing for the boardwalk. A larger ride. Something modern. Flashing lights, spinning arms, tall enough to be seen from down the beach. Something that really pulls in the younger crowd, he said. A few heads nodded. Someone mentioned ticket revenue. Someone else talked about tourist turnover and seasonal foot traffic. And then the conversation drifted, almost casually, to the carousel. Our surveys show people find it charming, a young woman explained while scrolling through a presentation slide. But most visitors treat it more like scenery. Something nostalgic. Another man leaned back in his chair. Well, he said with a grin, nostalgia's great, but nostalgia doesn't sell ride tickets the way adrenaline does. A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. And then the young developer sitting closest to the front gave a small shrug and said the sentence I still hear sometimes when the house gets too quiet at night. Honestly, he said, that carousel's mostly just an outdated ride nobody really cares about anymore. The room chuckled again. Not cruelly. Not with malice. Just the easy laughter of people who believe they're stating something obvious. I kept my hands folded in my lap and looked down at the floorboards for a moment. They were discussing square footage now. Maintenance costs. Structural updates. No one noticed the old man sitting near the back of the room. And why would they? I was just another gray-haired resident who had come to listen. The meeting moved forward in that careful, polite rhythm those community discussions always have. Charts appeared. Someone passed around printed proposals. Coffee cups were refilled. But my mind had drifted somewhere else entirely. Back to mornings when the boardwalk was still quiet. Back to the soft groan of the carousel's gears before the music started. Back to the feeling of polishing the brass poles while gulls circled overhead and the ocean wind rolled across the wooden planks beneath my feet. I worked that carousel for 17 summers. Not every day at first. Just weekends when I was younger. Then later full seasons once my regular job slowed down and I found myself wanting the steady rhythm of it. People think operating a ride is simple work. And in some ways it is. You check the safety latches. Help the smaller children onto the horses. Make sure nobody stands while the platform turns. Keep an eye on things. But what most folks don't realize is that when you stand beside a carousel long enough, you start to see something deeper than the ride itself. You see people's moments. Little pieces of their lives passing through. The first ride a nervous child takes without holding their mother's hand. Teenagers laughing too loudly on a summer date. Grandparents lifting toddlers onto painted horses while the sunset turns the Pacific orange behind them. The carousel didn't just spin in circles. It held thousands of tiny stories. And I was there for many of them. The meeting continued. One of the planners began explaining how the new attraction could include digital lighting, sound effects, maybe even interactive elements. Something immersive, she said. That word seemed to float around the room for a moment. Immersive. As if joy had only recently been invented. I stared out the window. From where we sat, you couldn't quite see the boardwalk itself, but you could hear the distant cry of gulls and the faint rumble of waves rolling onto the beach. Someone cleared their throat. Well, the city coordinator said after a while, glancing around the room, before we finalize anything, it might be useful to hear from people who remember the earlier days of the boardwalk. A pause settled over the chairs. He looked around politely. Anyone here worked down there years ago? For a moment no one moved. A couple of people glanced at one another. A few shrugged. Then, almost without thinking about it, I pushed my palms against my knees and slowly stood up. At 80 years old, standing isn't the smooth motion it used to be. There's a little pause while your bones remember how to cooperate. A few heads turned. Not with much interest at first. Just mild curiosity. The young developer who had laughed earlier glanced over his shoulder. I remember noticing how young his face looked. How confident. How certain that the future belonged to him. I cleared my throat. My name's Walter, I said. My voice came out softer than I expected, but steady. I worked that carousel, quite a few summers. A few people nodded politely. Someone gestured for me to continue. And for a moment I wasn't sure what I had planned to say. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me a little. Embarrassed, maybe. A touch foolish standing there in front of people half my age who had spreadsheets and projections and big plans for the place I once swept clean every morning before opening. But anger never really arrived. Instead something else did. A memory. It was the summer of 1974, I said slowly. The room grew quiet. Outside, somewhere far down the street, a gull cried against the wind. The sun was setting over the Pacific, I continued. One of those evenings where the sky turns that soft orange color and the lights along the boardwalk start flickering on one by one. I could almost hear the carousel music again. That cheerful organ melody drifting across the warm air. There was a little boy, I said. Nervous thing. Couldn't have been more than 5. A few people leaned forward slightly. He stood near the entrance for a long time watching the ride go around, I continued. Hands in his pockets. Didn't move. The young developer was listening now. Everyone was. Finally his mother knelt down beside him and said something quiet I couldn't hear. I paused. The memory was so clear it felt like looking through a window. And after a minute, he stepped forward. I rested one hand lightly on the back of the folding chair in front of me. I lifted him onto one of the horses. One of the outer ones with the blue saddle. The smell of cotton candy and salt air seemed to return for a moment. He grabbed the brass pole with both hands, I said, smiling faintly. Like it might run away if he didn't hold tight enough. A couple people chuckled softly. The ride started turning, I said. And for the first few seconds, that boy looked terrified. I paused again. The room had gone completely still. But then, I said quietly, something happened. The ride had barely made its first slow circle when I saw his shoulders loosen just a little. Not much. Just enough that his grip on the brass pole shifted from panic to something steadier. You learn to watch those things when you spend enough summers beside a carousel. At first he kept his eyes wide open, staring straight ahead like a sailor gripping the mast in rough water. The organ music was echoing under the canopy, that same bright tune we played 100 times a day, and the horses rose and dipped with the soft mechanical rhythm I knew better than my own breathing. His mother stood near the railing. Both hands wrapped around the wooden bar, leaning forward like parents always do when their children are trying something new. Halfway through the second circle, the boy did something small. He looked down. Just for a second. Down at the horse's painted mane, the blue saddle beneath him, the brass pole gleaming in the boardwalk lights that had just flickered on for the evening. And then he looked up again. Only this time he wasn't staring straight ahead anymore. He was looking out. Past the ride. Past the people waiting in line. Out toward the open sky over the ocean where the sunset was spilling gold across the water. And then he smiled. Not a big smile. Not one of those wide-open laughs children give when they're running on the beach. This was a quiet smile. The kind that sneaks onto a face when someone realizes they're not afraid anymore. I remember that moment because it happened so suddenly. 1 second the boy was clinging to the pole like a frightened squirrel. The next second he sat a little straighter. His hands loosened. And by the third circle he had lifted one hand into the air. Just a little. Testing it. Like he had seen other kids do. The wind from the ocean caught the sleeve of his little jacket and fluttered it behind him. His mother laughed from the railing. The carousel lights glowed warm against the evening sky. And the music kept playing. I didn't say anything at the time. That wasn't really my job. My job was to watch the platform, keep the timing right, make sure the ride stopped smooth when the music ended. But I remember thinking something then. Standing there beside the control lever while the sun disappeared behind the Pacific. I remember thinking that the world changes for people in moments so small most of us barely notice them happening. The ride finished its final turn. The music slowed. The platform eased to a stop with that soft mechanical sigh carousels make when the gears settle. I walked over and lifted the boy down from the horse. His legs were shaky when they touched the platform, but his eyes were shining. He looked up at me like I had just handed him the keys to something important. Again, he asked. I glanced at his mother. She laughed and shook her head. Maybe next time, she said, brushing his hair back. The boy nodded very seriously, like a man agreeing to terms. Then he took her hand. They walked away together into the evening crowd. I never saw him again. But I watched thousands of moments like that over the years. Some lasted only a few seconds. A first ride. A nervous laugh. A child discovering that the world could spin around them and still feel safe. The meeting room was very quiet when I finished speaking. No one interrupted. No one checked their phones. I wasn't telling the story to prove anything. And I didn't mention the developer's joke. I didn't say the carousel deserved saving. I didn't argue about modernization or tourism or ticket sales. I simply stood there beside the folding chairs and let the memory settle in the room the way the sound of carousel music used to drift across the boardwalk at dusk. After a while the city coordinator cleared his throat. That's a lovely story, he said gently. A few people nodded. The young developer looked down at the table for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. I guess, he said slowly, I never thought about it like that. And that was that. The meeting continued. They talked about budgets again. Safety inspections. Visitor surveys. Eventually the chairs folded up and people drifted toward the door in small conversations. No applause. No dramatic decision. Just the quiet ending of a meeting. I walked outside into the evening air. The Pacific wind was stronger now. The boardwalk lights were glowing in the distance, bright strings of color stretching along the shoreline. And there, rising above the rooftops, I could still see the top of the carousel canopy turning slowly beneath its ring of lights. I stood there for a long time. Long enough to hear the faint echo of the organ music drifting across the darkening beach. The same tune. Still spinning. Still carrying children around in patient circles the way it always had. Maybe one day they'll replace it. Maybe they won't. Time has a way of deciding those things without asking the people who remember how the past felt. But here's something I've learned in the years since that meeting. Rides come and go. Buildings change. Lights get brighter. Music gets louder. But the moments people carry with them, those don't disappear so easily. Somewhere out there that boy from 1974 grew up. Maybe he forgot the carousel entirely. Or maybe, every once in a while, when the wind smells faintly of salt and warm sugar, he remembers the evening he lifted one hand into the air and realized he wasn't afraid anymore. And if that memory stayed with him even a little, then the old ride was never just scenery. Not really. Because dignity in a life like mine was never about applause or recognition. It was about standing beside something simple for long enough to see how quietly it mattered. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the years feel heavier than they used to, I close my eyes and I can still hear that carousel turning. The soft hum of the motor. The rise and fall of painted horses. The laughter of children carried out over the Pacific wind. Going around and around. Just the way it always did.